The crash had left him with a limp, a dent in his helmet, and the kind of headache that made him consider whether a fragment of the ship's reactor casing had lodged itself into his skull. He sat there among the steaming wreckage, muttering at the smoking control panel as though it could still answer him, half convinced the ship had chosen this particular jungle to die in just to spite him. It wasn't even a dignified crash. No flames streaking across the sky, no heroes landing in a burst of triumph. Just a gradual whimpering descent, systems flickering out one by one until gravity got the last laugh. He pushed himself up, boots sinking into soil that smelled too alive. Not alive like Earth's forests. No, this was different. The air hummed as if every leaf and vine were gossiping about the intruder who had just arrived. He grunted and slapped the side of his helmet. "Don't start hallucinating now," he told himself. "We're not at that stage of the survival manual yet." The vines did not respond, which he counted as progress. The soldier, though he was starting to wonder how much of that identity was left after losing both squad and ship, dragged what gear he could salvage into a pile. A cracked blaster, 2 ration packs that now smelled of melted plastic, and a multi-tool with a blade so dull it might as well have been a butter knife. He sat back on his haunches, looking around the jungle for anything that resembled edible food. The vegetation loomed, oversized leaves dripping with condensation, flowers opening and closing as though breathing. Every sound carried too far, chittering, rustling, and once, a groan that made him clutch the useless blaster instinctively. It was while contemplating whether eating moss would kill him quickly or slowly that he heard the first laugh. Not mocking exactly, but light, amused, as though someone had seen him arguing with a ration pack and found it delightful. He froze, every sense tightening, the way years of combat had trained him. Then out of the foliage she stepped. At first his brain filed her under human. 2 arms, 2 legs, a face that looked startlingly ordinary until the details unsettled him. Her ears were elongated, tapering back like the curve of leaves stretched by wind. Her skin had a faint shimmer, as though something beneath it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. Her hair fell loose, streaked with threads of green so subtle he wondered if his concussion was coloring his vision. She regarded him with wide eyes, tilted in curiosity more than caution, and smiled in a way that made him feel like he was the punchline to a joke he hadn't heard yet. His training screamed at him to bark orders, establish control, demand identification. Instead, what came out was, you speak human." Her head tilted, ears twitching ever so slightly. Then she laughed again, light and unafraid. "You sound broken," she said, voice melodic and strange, accented with something he couldn't place. "Like your machine." She gestured at the smoking wreck behind him. He bristled. "That machine flew me halfway across the sector before it. Well, before it decided trees were more comfortable than orbit." "Trees are better," she replied, as if it were the most obvious truth in the galaxy. Then, to his horror, she stepped forward, crouched beside one of the glowing flowers at the jungle's edge, and plucked a fruit from a low branch. It pulsed faintly in her palm as though alive. She held it out to him with an expression somewhere between kindness and mischief. He eyed it suspiciously. "You're offering me a glowing fruit from a glowing plant in a glowing jungle that laughs at me. Do you understand how many survival manuals specifically tell me not to do that? Do you want to starve?" she asked plainly. He stared at the fruit, then at her. Finally, he muttered, "If I grow extra ears, I'm blaming you." He bit into it. Sweetness flooded his mouth, sharp but oddly refreshing, like biting into sunlight if sunlight could be chewed. He swallowed, half expecting his lungs to seize. They didn't. He was, disappointingly, still alive. She looked far too smug. "See, trees are better." The soldier wiped juice from his chin. "If this forest kills me, I'm haunting you." Her brows furrowed. "What is haunting?" "A long-term annoyance. Very advanced military tactic." She giggled again, and he realized with growing unease that the jungle around them seemed to respond. Leaves tilted toward her, roots shifted faintly under her feet. It was subtle but undeniable, as though the environment itself was listening. He pretended not to notice, mostly because acknowledging it meant adding another layer of strangeness to a day already overflowing with it. He busied himself checking his gear, ignoring her steady gaze. "Look, I don't know what you are." "Girl," she interrupted simply. "I am a girl." "Yes, fine, a girl, but what kind of girl? You don't exactly look like the locals in the recruitment posters." Her smile widened, almost sly. "You don't look like you belong here either." "Taché," he snorted and shook his head. "Great, I'm stranded with a smartass." They spent the next stretch of daylight in an uneasy sort of truce. She followed him as he scouted the area, walking barefoot through the undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf, while he crashed through like a drunken tank. Every time he tripped, she laughed quietly behind her hand, which only made him grumble louder. He tried at one point to explain his blaster, though it fizzled and sparked uselessly when he demonstrated. She watched with fascination, then burst into laughter when it discharged a pathetic puff of smoke. "Very scary," she said solemnly, before breaking into another grin. "Don't mock the weapon," he muttered. "It's sensitive." "Like you?" She asked deadpan. He almost choked. "I am not sensitive." "You complain a lot," she pointed out, ears twitching as if amused. "The trees hear you." That made him glance around uneasily. "Yeah, about that. Do they actually hear me?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she knelt by a patch of vines and brushed her fingertips across their leaves. The vines shifted, curling as if to greet her. His skin prickled. She looked back at him, smiling faintly. "Trees are better," she repeated. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "Fantastic. I've officially lost it, talking plants, laughing plant girls. Next thing you know, the moss is going to give me relationship advice." The moss did not, in fact, comment. But she laughed again, and somehow, despite everything, the wreckage, the hunger, the creeping realization that he was entirely at the mercy of this strange forest, he found himself laughing too. It was rusty, unused, but real, and though he would never admit it out loud, he felt lighter than he had in years. He hated the sound of his own boots. Every step echoed against the metal corridors, too loud in the silence, like an accusation he couldn't outrun. The station had been abandoned for years. At least, that's what the intel brief claimed. But the lights still flickered in irregular patterns, as though the place was breathing. He tightened his grip on the pulse rifle, more for comfort than necessity, because truthfully the weapon wasn't reliable anymore. Last time he fired it, it had spat out a single, sad blue spark that wouldn't have scared a house cat, let alone whatever lingered here. Still, a soldier needed rituals, so he carried it anyway. Rituals gave shape to chaos. Rituals reminded him he wasn't just wandering through an endless labyrinth of rusting airlocks and whispering vents. Rituals, however, didn't explain the laughter that floated down the corridor ahead, light and unmistakably feminine. He froze. The laugh wasn't cruel, wasn't ghostly. It was playful, the kind of sound you'd expect at a campfire, not in a dead orbital husk hanging above a forgotten world. He thought briefly about turning back, but the supply shuttle wasn't coming for 3 more days, and he'd run out of caffeine pills. Curiosity wasn't a choice. It was survival. The corridor opened into a hydroponics bay, long since overrun. Transparent tanks dripped with algae, vines crawled across the walls, and faint bioluminescence pulsed in the corners. It was humid, too humid for a station supposedly running on emergency power. And there she was. She looked like a woman mostly. Humanoid silhouette, long dark hair falling over her shoulders, the posture of someone completely at ease in her surroundings. But her ears curved long and sharp, catching the pale glow of the hydro lamps, and her skin carried that faint shimmer like chlorophyll hidden beneath flesh. She leaned against a cracked nutrient vat, plucking a greenish fruit that pulsed faintly and biting into it as though it were the most normal thing in the galaxy. "You're late," she said, mouth full of fruit as though she had been waiting specifically for him. He blinked, thrown off. "Late? This place has been abandoned for 20 years. She shrugged, still late. He shifted, unease prickling the back of his neck. "And you are." She swallowed, then grinned, juice glistening on her lips. "Hungry." She held out the half-eaten fruit. His stomach traitorously growled. He shook his head firmly. "No thanks, I don't eat things that glow. Military protocol." Her eyebrows arched. Military protocol also tells you to walk loudly down empty corridors so everything knows you're coming. He narrowed his eyes, ignoring the jab. "So you live here, alone, on an abandoned station?" "Not alone," she said, tilting her head as if listening to something in the vines. "They keep me company." As if on cue, one of the vines hanging from the ceiling shifted and curled toward her hand. She brushed her fingers along it, and the entire plant seemed to pulse faintly, glowing brighter for a heartbeat. He muttered, "Great, talking plants again. I was hoping the concussion back on Zeta 9 was the last time." She laughed softly, and the hydro bay seemed to brighten with it. "They don't talk, not like you mean, they remember." "That's worse," he said flatly, but he followed her anyway. Because the alternative was wandering back into those silent, humming corridors alone, and for all his training, he had no defense against loneliness. They walked past cracked glass chambers, the scent of old nutrient gel hanging in the air. She moved barefoot and silent, weaving around debris with grace, while he clomped behind her, snagging his jacket on vines and cursing under his breath. Every few minutes she looked back at him with that same amused smile, as though his frustration was a form of entertainment. "So what are you exactly?" he finally asked, more blunt than polite. "Girl," she said simply, as though that ended the matter. He rolled his eyes. "Yeah, I figured that much, but human, alien. Some kind of experimental hybrid, from a lab that should have filed more safety reports." Her smile turned secretive. "Does it matter?" "Yes," he said firmly, "because I need to know if you're going to sprout leaves in the middle of the night and strangle me with them." She actually laughed out loud at that, a sound that startled a flock of tiny winged things from a nest overhead. "If I wanted to strangle you, I'd have done it already." "Comforting," he muttered. She stopped suddenly, placing a hand on the wall. He almost collided with her before noticing the way the vines around them seemed to be shifting, curling tighter. She pressed her ear against the metal bulkhead, then stepped back. "Something's coming." He lifted his useless rifle automatically. "Something like what?" "Machine," she said. "Old angry doesn't like me." As if summoned, the floor shuddered. Down the corridor, a light flickered, mechanical, harsh, cutting across the dim glow of the plants. A probe, military design, wheeled into view. Its sensors scanned the bay, locking onto him first before jerking toward her. A cold, synthetic voice barked. "Biological anomaly detected. Initiating purge." The soldier cursed under his breath. "See, this is why we can't have nice things." She didn't look frightened. Instead, she touched the wall again, and the vines above twisted violently, dropping down to lash against the probe's chassis. Sparks flew as the machine struggled, firing a weak laser that scorched the floor. He fired his rifle out of habit. It sputtered, coughed, and emitted a single sad pop. She glanced at him with an almost wicked smile. "Very scary weapon." He scowled. "It worked better when I had spare parts." The probe cut through the vines with a burst of heat, rolling forward, sensors glowing red. She held out her hand, and suddenly the very floor beneath them shifted. Roots cracked through the metal plating, wrapping around the probe's wheels, pinning it in place. It screeched in protest, gears grinding. He, meanwhile, did the only thing he could think of. He ran forward and kicked it. Hard. The probe jolted sideways, smacking into the nutrient vat. With a burst of sparks, it short-circuited, whining before collapsing into silence. Panting, he leaned against the wall. He didn't argue, because something in her tone made him think of the names carved into memorial walls back home. Names of soldiers who had disappeared into nothing but statistics. The silence stretched until he broke it, mostly because silence made him uncomfortable. "So, what does that mean, you can photosynthesize or something?" She glanced at him, ears twitching with amusement. He didn't argue, because something in her tone made him think of the names carved into memorial walls back home. Names of soldiers who had disappeared into nothing but statistics. The silence stretched until he broke it, mostly because silence made him uncomfortable. "So, what does that mean, you can photosynthesize or something?" She glanced at him, ears twitching with amusement. "Do you want me to try?" He put up both hands. "No, no, I believe you. Last thing I need is you lying in the sun while I haul all the supplies." "You're very dramatic," she observed. "Occupational hazard." The humor between them did not erase the unease. When night came, the forest seemed to shift. Strange lights floated between the trees, and the air carried a low hum, like circuitry hidden in the soil. He kept the useless rifle across his lap anyway, listening for threats. She sat beside him, eyes half closed, as though listening to something deeper than the sounds around them. "What are you doing?" he asked finally. "Talking," she murmured. "With who?" She tapped the ground gently. "Them." "The plants." She opened one eye. "You say it like it's strange." He stared at her. "Because it is strange. Talking to plants is what people do right before being escorted to a padded room. Believe me, I've seen it." "And yet," she said, closing her eye again, "you're still listening." He didn't have an answer for that, so he muttered something about keeping watch and tried to ignore the way the roots beneath him seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if settling into a more comfortable position. Hours later, when he finally drifted into half-sleep, he dreamed of branches stretching across the stars, roots wrapping around shattered moons, and her laughter echoing through it all like a thread pulling him forward. He woke with a start, sweaty and confused, only to find her still sitting calmly beside him, smiling faintly. "Bad dreams?" she asked. "Yeah," he admitted, rubbing his face. "Weird ones, too many trees." "Trees are better," she replied softly. He groaned. "If you keep saying that, I'm going to start carving it into my helmet." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "That would look good." For a long time after, he lay there pretending to be annoyed, but secretly listening to the strange, impossible forest breathe around them. He never thought the end would smell like sunlight. Not smoke, not blood, not the scorched metal tang of plasma fire. Just that faint green sweetness, like the air after rain, carried on a breeze that had no right to exist inside a half-dead orbital station. He stood in the hydroponics bay with his rifle slung uselessly across his shoulder, trying to convince himself this wasn't some fevered dream stitched together by a brain gone soft. Beside him, she crouched barefoot on the cracked tiles, one hand pressed to the vines that had overtaken the walls. The plants pulsed faintly, their glow rising and falling in rhythm with her breathing. He cleared his throat. "So let me get this straight. If I help you plug yourself into the core systems, you'll, what? Sing the station back to life." She smiled faintly without looking at him. "Not sing, grow." "Right," he muttered. "Because that's so much more reassuring." Her long ears twitched, and for a moment he thought she was laughing at him silently. He scowled, but not too seriously. Over the days, he'd grown used to her strange humor, her quiet confidence, the way she looked at him like he was both ridiculous and necessary. And maybe he was. The probe attack had changed everything. His own people would come eventually, and when they did, they'd see her as nothing but contamination. The thought of it made his stomach twist. Weeks ago, he wouldn't have hesitated to follow orders. Now he was standing in a jungle that shouldn't exist, planning to sabotage his own recovery so an alien plant girl wouldn't be cleansed. "Funny thing," he said, mostly to fill the silence. "I joined the army to protect human colonies, and now here I am protecting, well, you." "Trees are better," she replied simply. He snorted. "Yeah, you've been saying that a lot. Maybe I'm starting to believe you." The vines shifted under her touch, parting to reveal an access panel glowing faintly with residual power. She looked back at him, eyes steady. "It won't be easy. Machines don't like me." "Machines don't like me either," he said, tapping the rifle. "We have that in common." The plan was simple in the way only truly insane plans are. She would bind herself to the station's systems through the overgrown hydroponics network, essentially turning the entire orbital husk into a living extension of herself. He would act as her guard, keeping the defense drones and recovery team at bay long enough for her to take root. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the idea of her succeeding or the idea of her failing. When the recovery team arrived, they didn't knock. The station shuddered as docking clamps slammed into place, and his comm crackled to life for the first time since the crash. A flat voice announced, "Lieutenant, stand down and prepare for extraction. The anomaly will be purged." He looked at her, at the faint glow in her veins, at the way the plants around her leaned in like children seeking comfort. Something in his chest tightened. He clicked off the comm without answering. "Guess I just went AWOL," he muttered. She tilted her head. "AWOL. Means I finally started thinking for myself," he said. The first drone burst through the bay doors, weapons trained. He fired before it could speak, his rifle coughing out a sputtering bolt that scorched its sensors. Sparks flew, but the drone kept coming. He swore loudly and kicked it into a wall, where roots surged up to finish the job, wrapping around it until it sparked once, then died. She gave him that amused, infuriating smile. "Tactical kick." "Very tactical," he panted. More drones poured in. The bay became chaos, vines lashing, roots splitting the floor, metal shrieking as machines fired and plants absorbed the impact. He fought alongside her, his blaster barely functional, his fists and boots doing more work than his training ever prepared him for. Between each strike, between each half-panicked joke, "Do you think this qualifies me for gardening duty?" He realized something startling. He wasn't fighting out of duty anymore. He wasn't fighting for medals or orders or survival. He was fighting because he wanted her to live. At last the vines sealed the bay doors, cutting off the last wave of drones. He stumbled back, panting, covered in sweat and bruises. She remained kneeling by the core panel, eyes closed, glowing faintly as the entire station seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Lights flickered on in distant corridors, long-dead systems humming awake. "You did it," he breathed.